Lisa, welcome to the show. You are one of the most cited scientists in the neuroscience and psychology fields in the world. So I cannot think of anyone better to ask this very complex question to. How is it possible that this body, this brain, can manifest itself or construct itself some sort of psychological system? In other words, what is consciousness, Lisa? Going very deep, very quick.
Let's start off with a small question. So I think, I think one way to think about it is to take some clues from evolution and the evolution of the nervous system. So that's usually where I start when I'm curious about a question. And one of the first things that an animal has to be able to do, really, is when an animal is moving around under its own steam, meaning, it has some kind of body parts that can move it around, whether it's, limbs or fins or whatever. It has to be able, the nervous system has to be able to distinguish between the sensory consequences of the animal's own movements and the sensory consequences of other things that happen in the world, right? So if I'm a fish, say, and, I'm swimming in the ocean, in the water, I'm going to be buffeted around all the time by waves and currents. And I'm also going to have sensory consequences of my own swimming. But those are useful for regulating the body, but they're not useful for telling you what's around you, whether there's predators around you, whether there's prey that you want to, that will be useful to you. And so the first thing that a nervous system really has to be able to do, if there are moving body parts, is make that sort of me, not me distinction. And philosophers and neuroscientists think that actually is the beginnings of consciousness, because you are now in a position, an animal is in a position to have what's called presence or a perspective on the world. So I think that's one thing that a nervous system has to be able to do. It has to be able to distinguish between the sensory consequences that are necessary to regulate the body and the sensory consequences of stuff that happens in the world that's relevant. What's really interesting, I think, is that when you're able to do this, a nervous system is able to do this, you kind of get a sense of an exteroceptive sense of the world, which is called exteroceptive, meaning the world around you, for free. So if you go back and you look at the earliest animals, they didn't have a lot in the way of exteroceptive senses. They couldn't, like the earliest animals really couldn't see. They didn't have eyes. They didn't have ears. They didn't have a nose. They couldn't smell. They had a very simple sense of touch. They had a vestibular cell to keep them upright in the water so they didn't, fall over. They had what's called an eye spot for light and dark, which regulated their circadian rhythm, the rhythms in their body, the metabolic rhythms in their bodies. And they had and importantly, because they could move around under their own steam, even though they didn't really know that much, they couldn't see, they couldn't hear, they didn't know that much about what was going on around them in the world. They had information senses about the internal state of the body. And what's really interesting is that when something would impinge on an animal, even without very sophisticated external senses, it would disrupt their internal coordination, the internal coordination of their systems. Their internal systems were disrupted. And that internal disruption told them that something was going on in the world. It didn't tell them what, It didn't tell them where. It didn't tell them what to do. It just was like, oh, something's wrong or something's present, right? So if light turned to dark, if a shadow passed over, if something buffeted it that wasn't a consequence of its own movements, it didn't really know what or where or how to deal with it necessarily, but just that something was there. And this is also a very basic part of our consciousness. When we have a disruption in the coordination of the internal senses that we have, the senses of our body, we experience that as simple feelings of affect, of feeling pleasant, feeling unpleasant, feeling worked up, feeling calm. And that disruption can come from any source, right? It could be you didn't sleep well, you're running low on glucose, you're dehydrated, or it could be that many meters away you see someone walking down the hall who you've had a conflict with. Anything can cause a disruption of that internal coordination and make you feel alerted or jittery or kind of unpleasant. And what we do immediately is we look to the world to try to figure out what was the cause, when sometimes the cause is actually something to do with the internal workings of our own body. Like maybe we're, having a metabolic issue or something, but we're always looking to the outside world to tell us what's wrong, so that we can try to figure it out. So this sort of combination of two things that I've mentioned, this having an internal set of sensory systems that are coordinated, that can be perturbed, and can be perturbed even when you have very limited outside senses of the outside world, plus this ability to distinguish between sensations that are caused by your own movement or by the regularities in the world that are not that relevant to you to be conscious of, and something that happens that you need to respond to. These two things really give you the very, very basis of consciousness that we probably share with many, many, many other animals. Now, there are other facets of consciousness that we could talk about, but I think those are the ones that are very close to the brain's most important job, which is controlling the systems of your body in the most metabolically efficient way.
I mean, and it's great that you mentioned exteroception and interoception, because it forms the fundamental basis of how we paint our picture regarding reality. And a lot of your work focuses on affect and emotion, but you always touch on the fact that we're constantly guessing, trying to make the most appropriate assumption of what's happening out there amidst this bombardment of sensory stimuli, that is entering our system. When you think about that, and you think about the fact that we have this almost limited access to reality because we have to pick and choose our responses, how do you feel about our perception of reality in general? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're asking me these really big questions. So here's what I would say. Your brains did not evolve to perceive reality accurately. They evolved to keep an animal alive and well long enough to reproduce and, in certain cases, raise offspring to reproductive age. Mm-hmm. And that means, for example, we can only perceive the world with the sensory surfaces of our bodies, right? So your retina will take in wavelengths of light from along a particular spectrum, but there's other parts of the spectrum that you can't see and that you'll never see without special help. So scientists build tools so that we can see farther and deeper and wider than our own eyes will allow us to, by translating these other parts of the light spectrum into something visible that we can see, right? So, so in part, we can only sense the world through the sensory surfaces of our own bodies, and that means right there we're not obviously perceiving reality accurately because we're missing some information. And then there's the issue that that actually taking in information from the sensory surfaces and learning that information in your brain is actually really metabolically expensive thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably the most expensive thing that your brain does, other than move your body around and keep your body healthy. So you can't learn everything. You only learn some things. And your brain is constantly guessing, like, what's important, what is signal that I have to learn, and what is noise that I can safely ignore. So, for example, if I were to visit you in South Africa, where I've never been before,
you'd come visit it. Very, very lovely place.
I've heard that it's a very lovely place, and there's also some wonderful science being done there. So there's a good reason for me to visit. But let's say that I came for a visit, and there are probably things that are occurring around you in the world that I would be unfamiliar with, right? And so what would be happening is I would be looking to you to whenever an unusual sound occurred that was unusual to me or novel, or a sight was novel, or something occurred that was novel and was ambiguous to me because maybe I don't really have the prior experience to make sense of it. I'd look to you to basically indicate, is this something I should pay attention to and learn, or can I ignore this? And it doesn't have to be done by even speaking to each other. So, for example, if you and I are sitting in a coffee shop and you hear, and then a siren occurs, if you turn to look, I'll turn to look. If you keep talking to me and you don't turn, I probably won't turn. I'm going to use cues from you. And we do this with each other all the time, with eye contact and with by other means. And this is what we do with our children, right? So with infants, right? An infant brain is not a miniature adult brain. It's a brain that is waiting for wiring instructions from the world to finish wiring itself. And part of that wiring comes from caregivers basically indicating to the infant and the child what stimuli, what signals from the world are relevant and have to be learned, and what can be ignored. And of course, we don't necessarily do it necessarily overtly with words, although with infants and children, we often do it with words. We're often curating things for them, labeling things for them, so that we're drawing their attention to certain pieces of information. The other thing, just to answer your question about, do we perceive reality accurately? So the third part of this is actually, as you yourself, your brain right now is sampling information from the world. That sampling is actually yoked to the state of your own body. So unbeknownst to you, even taking information in from the retina and that information making its way to your brain is yoked to your heartbeats. So if there's a certain phase of your heart where it's easier for your brain to take in visual input, and a certain phase of your heart where it's harder for your brain to do that. And so if your heart is racing, the consequence will be that it will be more difficult for you to take in information about the world. And what this means is that, every experience we have, every action we take is a combination of what's in our heads and what's in the world. And if you're not sampling the world particularly well, you're pretty much going to go with what's in your head. So there's a real continuum and lots of reasons for why we don't perceive the world exactly the way it is. That being said, the world is wired into our brains. The statistical regularities of the world are wired into our brains. And so the guesses that we're making, the predictions that we're making that are part of what we experience are to some extent linked to the regularities that we can sense. They're just not always, they don't have perfect fidelity with what's out there. They're also yoked to the state of our own bodies, actually.
Do your views align with sort of, if you think about Helmholtz inference, the way the Bayesian-like theories of the brain work, would you say your views on the way the brain works follows that type of path?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and my views are not my, I mean, I suppose they're my views, but I'm really very data driven. So, and I didn't, I didn't start off as a neuroscientist. So I wasn't ever indoctrinated into the, indoctrinated into the sort of ontological framework or the assumptions of neuroscientists. I came to my opinions, I would say, on the basis of, later training, which allowed me to ask many, 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 many difficult questions of people and of the data itself. And so, but yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that Bayesian logic is hierarchical Bayesian logic is I think a reasonable way to describe what a brain is doing.
Mm-hmm. And so when we take into account the fact that we're using these heuristics, these shortcuts to analyze whatever environment we're in, to make quick on-the-spot decisions when we need to, how do you think that impacts the way we perceive mental health? For example, the fact that psychiatry is very focused on biological basis of illness, whereas we know that we're not just biological beings. And I'm not anti-psychiatry, by the way. I always like to make that very clear. But the fact that we're embodied beings in an environment continuously having to interact with it plays such a big role on it.
Yeah, I would
receptive signals the way you were just discussing.
I would say it differently than you, I think. So first of all, I would say I don't think of these as heuristics at all. I mean, I know scientists talk about heuristics, and we can also talk about how these processes arise or give rise to heuristics. But what I'm talking about is just, this is business as usual for how your brain works. So your brain is trapped in your skull. It's trapped in a dark, silent box, your skull. And it's only receiving inputs from the sensory surfaces of your body that are the outcomes of some set of changes in your body and in the world. But your brain doesn't know what the changes are. It only receives evidence about the outcomes. So if you hear a loud bang, what is it? What should you do about it? What caused it? I mean, it could be many, many, many things, right? It could be lightning or thunder. It could be somebody slamming a door. It could be a car crashing. It could be a gunshot. It could be many things. And what your brain does next depends on what it believes the cause is of that. Similarly, when you feel a tug in your chest, what is it? Your brain doesn't know. Your brain has to guess. It could be, that you have indigestion after dinner. It could be the beginnings of a heart attack. It could be there's some uncertainty in the world, and your brain is attempting to learn new information, which usually comes along with a increase in breathing and heart rate and so on. So your brain has to always guess, and it's always guessing predictively. So it uses past experience to make a guess about what's going to happen next. And that guess is essentially a guess about the causes of the sensory data that you're about to receive. And that's not a heuristic. That's how it happens. That's just how it works. And then the data come from your body and from the world, and then your brain compares, and either this confirms the predictions or it adjusts them. And I think this is happening all the time, and it's happening in mental health, and it happens in mental illness. I would say the problem with psychiatry is not the focus on biology. The problem is because everything that you experience, every mental experience you have has biological elements to it. What I would say is the problem in psychiatry is that they take a reductionist approach to science. They try to isolate individual causes for illness, like is it genes, or is it the environment, or is it, is it this, or is it that? When in fact, your brain is a complex system. And by a complex system, I don't mean, wow, it's like super complicated. I mean, it is super complicated, but it's a complex system, meaning there are many non-linear interacting forces which produce any mental feature that you experience. So if you feel really unpleasant, like you're feeling real distress, that distress doesn't have its source in one cause or two causes. There are many, 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 many factors that are all working together. And actually exactly the same mental feature can have multiple causes. So many, weak interacting forces requires not reductionism, where you try to isolate. It requires a strategy in science called holism, where you try to study the whole system. And when you perturb the system with one thing, you have to try to measure all the other things. And so when I report a symptom like distress or fatigue or whatever, that symptom stands in for that whole orchestra of causes. So the biology, if we knew what all the causes were, and we knew the multiple patterns of causes that could produce the same mental feature, that's called degeneracy, having multiple causes for the same outcome. If we knew what those were, we could definitely still, that would stand in for a subjective experience of unpleasantness, or a subjective experience of fatigue, or what have you. But we don't know what all of those patterns are, and we don't actually know what all the causes are. Even something as simple as feeling unpleasant or feeling distressed is not actually simple at all. There are multiple contributions to that mental feature. And frankly, nobody has any idea how mental features are conjured from the brain as a complex dynamic system. There are lots of hypotheses out there, but no one really knows. That's what, David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. Nobody really knows. Pointing to a brain region or pointing to a couple of genes or whatever is not a solution, because that probably only accounts for some very small proportion of the variance in, your feelings at any given point in time.
I mean, with that being said, do you ever think, because there's this quest, of course, to study the neural correlates of consciousness and to try and determine exactly which neurotransmitters and which interactions between cells represent subjective phenomenal experiences. Do you think that's a possibility? Do you think that's something we could actually do, to look at brain scans, look at certain investigations, and actually say this is exactly what someone is experiencing?
Well, I think that people are going about it the wrong way. So, and of course, I don't know what every single scientist is doing in every single lab around the world, but I think that the research that I'm familiar with already, it already constrains the search space in a way that makes it impossible to discover anything other than what it's looking for. And as a consequence, it's missing half the story. So I think that, for example, most people, not everyone, but many scientists are looking for the neural correlates of consciousness in the cortex, cerebral cortex. But if what I said is correct, that there's a very, that consciousness has many features, and one feature is this feature of presence or subjective presence or stance on the world, that the ability to distinguish between sensory signals that are independent of you and sensory signals that are related to your own physical body. And I don't mean interoceptive versus exteroceptive here. I mean even exteroceptive sensory changes that are related to the movement of your body. Then that means that many, many, many animals have at least some element of consciousness. Because even the simplest animal, like, actually, who writes really well about this is Peter Godfrey Smith.
The Other Minds.
Yeah, that's a beautiful book, I think. I think he writes extremely well about this, and he has these really lovely examples of crabs and of course and I guess I would say I somewhat agree with his analysis of affect. I don't completely, the feelings of pleasantness, unpleasantness, and so on. I don't completely agree with what he's written there, but I also think he's in the process of figuring out what he thinks about that. So I'm going to cut him some slack.
He talks about the octopus as well. Very
fast. And I mean, the octopus, I think, we know octopuses have very complex cognition, and we know that they're capable of really remarkable things. But I think what I found really interesting about Metazoa, the newer book, Metazoa, is that he's making the point that some really simple animals, or what we think of as simple, actually have presence. They actually have to be able to distinguish between themselves and the world, and that means they have a form of consciousness, and that form of consciousness doesn't have anything to do with the cerebral cortex.
I think someone who also talks about something very similar. You were mentioning the fact that South Africans are doing some great research. I know Professor Mark Solms does a very similar thing, where he talks about consciousness being something more at a base level rather than just purely a cortical.
I think my beef with him is that I think he believes in sort of ancient emotion circuits lurking in some kind of ancient inner beast inside a human brain, and there's just no really good evidence for that, and so I would say there's really, really nice work done by Bjorn Merker, who has written about the importance of the midbrain actually in consciousness in humans. And, it turns out that he's identified this part of the brain called the superior colliculus, which in non-human animals, in non-mammals is called the tectum. And it turns out to be really overlooked by many, many, many scientists. And of course, I'm not saying that consciousness lives in the superior colliculus. I'm saying that consciousness is a multifaceted phenomenon, and it has many features, and the different features are not going to be all found in the cerebral cortex. So, or in the back of the cortex, in the front of the cortex, in the coherence in the cortex, and I think that it's just much more complicated than that. And I would like to see people take a more whole brain approach. Scientists tend to look at the brain, look at parts of the brain and study those parts for what they're interested in themselves. And they tend to ignore all the other things that those parts might do that they themselves are not particularly, interested in. And I think this is, again, I would say, that's what makes this a challenge, because you probably have to take a whole brain approach to really understand something as complicated as
someone else who brings up the superior colliculus or or the ancient optic tectum for a lot of animals, is Michael Graziano, when he talks about the fact that that is the first step to attention. And he tries to work out how we've then developed these models that keep track of this attention mechanism. And that sort of viewpoint then leads to what is known in the philosophical sphere as illusionism, as a theory of consciousness. Michael doesn't describe it as an illusion. He prefers the word caricature. We create a caricature of our existence. What do you think about that? Do you think that we have some sort of an essence-like quality when it comes to consciousness, or rather we've got this intelligence, this ability to acknowledge our own attention and thereafter draw some sort of ethereal conclusion about our existence?
I guess I would say I don't think that there's an essence to consciousness. I don't think there's an essence to anything. I think essentialism in general is a bad ontological road. It's just not helpful. Really, it's not helpful. It's like every ill in society. It has its roots in essentialism. That sounds very essentialistic, doesn't it? But I really do. Of course, it's not only that, but it is necessarily that. And I would say the same thing is true in science. So I think I find Michael's work very compelling. There's all kinds of work that he does, on motor control that I find really, really compelling. I guess what I would say is, I would say I wouldn't call it a caricature. I would say if you look at the structure of the cerebral cortex, its architectural design. I'm not saying it evolved in this way for this purpose. I'm just saying this is what it's doing is compressing. It's reducing the dimensionality of sensory motor patterns. It's compressing them. Mm-hmm. So information that comes in from the thalamus to, the primary sensory regions of the cortex, as the information makes its way to the front of the brain, it's losing detail. Mm. And so you get these at the front of the brain, these multimodal summaries. Now, you might call it a caricature. Somebody else might call it semantic memory. Someone else might call it an abstract concept. It all means the same thing, that the brain has ways of distilling information. And this way of distilling information is really important to planning and to planning motor action, but it's also really important to innovating your environment, whether you're, a non-human animal or a human animal. So, humans sort of take this to the, to the extreme in some ways. We can, we impose functions on things that they physically don't have by their physical nature. And then we all agree on those functions, and then poof, they have those functions. So money, for example, is a really good, it's the example everyone goes to. Little pieces of paper don't inherently have value. They only have value to trade for material goods because we all agree that they have value. And many, many things have been used as currency throughout the course of human history that physically look nothing like each other. There's no essence to little pieces of paper or even to diamonds, frankly, as currency. It's just we all agree they're valuable, and then they become valuable. Or mortgages, right? Or, this may be a very contentious thing to say in South Africa. It's certainly contentious to say in the United States, but skin tone. Skin tone is on a continuum, and the selection pressures on skin tone have to do with vitamins, and UV light. So it has to do with these very biological things. Skin tone doesn't predict anything else about a person. Except where their ancestors lived in relation to UV light.
Yes.
But we impose meaning on skin tone. We impose meaning on having breasts and a vagina versus a penis. We impose meaning. We impose all kinds of meaning on physical things that they didn't evolve to have. And then we all agree. And then, or at least some of us do. when some of us withdraw our agreement, then we have, a war, or at least a lot of political strife. But that's so it's not just that we're caricaturing; it's that we can see similarities functionally similarities in things that don't look the same, don't smell the same, don't taste the same, and that ability means that we can we can add to the environment that we live in. We're not just adapting to an environment that's there, we're actually augmenting that environment. And other animals do this too. They just do it in ways that we find less impressive. We're very impressed with ourselves, as a species. So, and with good reason. I mean, we've done amazing things as a species, but other animals also do pretty amazing things, and they also add to their environments by virtue of their ability to abstract or to see similarities or invent similarities where functional similarities where they might not be obvious. So when we're taking in information from our bodies and from the world, that's what we're doing with it. And what's interesting is that there's a constant dialogue between all of the places in the nervous system where where information about the brain's belief about what's going on inside and outside is making contact with sense data that's coming from the inside and the outside. The colliculus is one of those regions, but so is the cerebellum, and so is the hippocampus, and so is the cerebral cortex. And they're all running a model of the body in the world. They're just doing it, they're integrating over different things, and then they're speaking to each other. And that's really what gives rise to your actions and your mind, frankly.
What do you think happened along the way? Because I mean, Michael also wrote a book called Consciousness and the Social Brain. I mean, we're fundamentally a social species. Everything we do revolves around each other. And that's the only reason why we're actually at this pinnacle we like to put ourselves on in the first place. But what do you think is happening as time is going by that's making these, what was once a purely adaptive response to the environment and helped us, but now is raging wars, is just causing so much polarization amongst the online sphere? What do you think has gone wrong with, with the biology and the
another question which has 100 different parts of an answer to it? So I would say you're very good at asking these really majestic questions.
Thanks.
Well, I think that I think it's a common, again, there's real complexity here, meaning multiple forces interacting. So one thing is, I found this really fascinating. So I'll just take one step back and say, so one question I've always had when I'm reading in the scientific literature, and I'll be reading a paper about a particular species, and I'll wonder to myself, like, why did they choose this species to study and not some other species, right? So macaque monkeys. The macaque monkeys are very common species to study, and there are particular species that are studied really frequently, and they happen to be, have a very strict dominance hierarchy, and they can be really violent with each other, and they're also very social, and they're very, they're also very they also take care of their young and whatever, but they have these characteristics. And so is it that, and some scientists like to say that they're very similar to humans, and so is that why is it that we have an idea of what we're like as a species, and then we go and pick the animals that we think are similar to us? Or because it turns out there are macaques that don't have a really strict dominance hierarchy, and that it's much more flexible. And also with chimps, right? So you've got chimp, and then it turns out that most of the chimps who were studied in labs were removed from their mother's care probably 5 to 10 years earlier than, like, by force. And so they probably have attachment disorders, these chimps, right? I mean, I'm not saying that flippantly. I'm saying it's very serious. These chimps probably really suffered in ways that are really significant. And in that way, they are like us, I would say. But I guess my point is that we have an idea of what we're like as a species, okay? And that idea is that inside we're brutes, basically. And we have to control that with reason. And if we don't control it, either if we can't control it, then we're mentally ill. And if we refuse to control it, then we're just immoral. But basically, your brain is a battleground, and that's what makes you who you are, how you deal with that battleground. Well, it turns out that if you look anthropologically, that's not exactly right. And actually, if you look at when intergroup violence starts to emerge, and I mean, at least from what we can tell from records, right? So you have to have some kind of record. And if you look at dominance, when did dominance hierarchies start to emerge in a cult? When in a group even, it has to do with the accumulation of goods. So hunter-gathering groups are not competitive. They don't have a strict hierarchy. They're really egalitarian. It's really, and gender is actually also tied up in this, which I also found super interesting. So groups that were much more egalitarian in their assignment of roles to men and women were seen as, kind of more primitive, and so if you go back to the dawn of, just before the dawn of farming, basically, what you see is that the evidence doesn't really support this idea that we're just all really competitive with each other. And it's much more egalitarian, much more focused on being a social animal. And with farming and then agriculture,
yes,
and the accumulation of goods that could be passed down from one generation to another, that's where you start to see the kinds of characteristics emerging that we now think of as natural. I was stunned to learn this, actually.
Are you with the bonobo species in Congo?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that came earlier, so I read about, but there are also macaques also that are not as hierarchical as the ones that are typically studied. And there's a lot of diversity in the way that animals maintain social ties, particularly when they're social animals like us who evolved to be the caretakers of each other's nervous systems. So this is a problem, for humans, because at least in the West, there's this idea that, you're very, you achieve things based on your own individual merits. You have freedom to do and act as you please. But amidst all of this individual freedom, rights and freedoms, there's the biological reality that we are actually physiologically dependent on each other. And we do influence each other in ways that we are largely unaware of. And that causes a conflict that people find really difficult to even sometimes talk about. I mean, when I first raised this issue of this conflict, people accused me of being an enemy of free speech, and actually, it basically brought down the wrath of the alt-right in the United States on me and my family. And it was a very, very scary.
I can only imagine that must have been very traumatic.
It was
very scary.
But what happened was, who came to my aid? Two different police forces, at the university and in my town where I live. And they banded together to protect my house, protect my lab, protect my family, protect the people in my lab. I had anyways, my point being that, it was a community response, right? So, so again, sort of making the point that we are,
just like touching on that, at this very moment in South Africa, one of our former presidents he was just sent to prison for all the corruption that had occurred during his reign as president. And once he went to prison, there were outbreaks and riots around the entire country. People started mass looting stores. My family, I'm in Cape Town, South Africa, my family are in a different city. They weren't able to leave their house because it was so violent, such an outburst, an outcry, even though the president was so corrupt, so blatantly in the wrong. So many people still seem to latch onto this idea or identity that he represented. And it makes you wonder, why do we place so much emphasis on certain values, certain ethics or moral decisions? Why do you think we do this? What do you think drives this?
Well, again, I would say when someone becomes, so one aspect of our ability to abstract, to find things similar by virtue of the function they serve, as opposed to their physical features, right? Is that we can point to one feature and have it stand in for a bunch of others. So like a word, right? So when I say a word like soccer ball, a ball to you, that word is referring to many different features that I don't have to tell you about. I can just say one word that has some sounds and conjure those features in your head, right? So that's really efficient. That's an efficient way of communication. So if I say to you, I had pizza for dinner last night, I don't have to tell you that it was a piece of bread that was grilled and it was flat and it had cheese on it and had this and that. No, I just say, okay. Now, sometimes we don't get all the features right. So I have a set of features in my head and I can conjure those features in your head, through words, which is kind of like, this is our mental telepathy, words, right? And if you're from Chicago, you might think, mistakenly, I might add, that pizza is supposed to have a deep crust. This is like, but in fact, being from the East Coast, I know the true pizza has very thin crust. But so there might be some of these disagreements, but in general, so when you look at someone, when a person becomes a symbol, so instead of, we have other symbols too, right? Words are just one kind of symbol. They're just terrific. I mean, they're terrifically efficient symbols, but there are other types of symbols too. You look at your president, this former president, I'm sure he stands in for many features.
Definitely.
And yeah, and the thing is that his value for signifying features might not be the same features to every single person who comes to his defense, right? And even more so, I would say, you and I and every person on this planet have multiple features that make up our identity. You don't have one identity. You aren't one self. You're many selves. So, in this context, the features of my identity that are most salient have to do with science and being a scientist. But if we were in a different context, the features that would be salient for me might be that I'm a mother, or that I'm a friend, or that I'm a cook, like a chef. I wouldn't actually call myself a chef, but a cook, or maybe, a gardener or whatever, right? But there are, we think of ourselves as having an essence, like a true self, but we don't really. We have many selves, and who we are is really dependent to some extent on who we're with and what we're doing, what the context is.
And it's precisely that point where all those people were threatening you, attempting to attack you, is because they were only focused on on a specific self of yours that they have access to. They don't know the mother. They don't know the cook. They don't know.
Right, exactly. And actually, what I ended up doing at a certain point was, against my husband's wishes, was I started to email back to people and say, I don't respond to threats and insults, but if you seriously want to have a conversation, tell me what your disagreement is, and then we can seriously have a chat. And I would say 7 people out of maybe 7,000 emails, took me up on that proposition. And it was fascinating, actually. In the last election in the United States, I, for the first time in my life, decided that I would make calls for the candidate who I wanted to win, solely for the purpose of getting to talk to people on the other side. I really wanted to talk to people.
I'm assuming it was Biden.
Yes, it was. So my family and I, we all started making calls on behalf of Joe Biden pretty early on in the election. And we were calling, I live in Massachusetts. It's a very, very I'm not likely to run into there are some Trump supporters who live here, but there aren't that many. But I wanted to talk to Republicans. I wanted to talk to Republicans who were Trump supporters. And what I really wanted to do was, I really wanted to understand why. It's just too easy to say, oh, well, that person's an idiot, so obvious, or that person is very, and one of the things I realized is that because there's so much division in people's points of view, and they don't talk to each other, in part because of social media, but not exclusively. It's just made it much worse. And also because, frankly, talking to people who disagree with you makes them less predictable to you, and anything which is less predictable to you is metabolically costly and feels like shit. So, talking to people who you can't predict what they're going to say, and you can't necessarily predict, you don't necessarily know how you're going to respond. That's actually stressful. And in an economic downturn, when there's a pandemic, and it's really hard, right? And so you sort of can't blame people necessarily for shying away from that kind of interaction. But that's a whole other kind of conversation. But anyways, but because there's this polarization, whoever is president, half the country feels disengaged. Half the country feels like their values aren't being represented. Half the country feels isolated and alienated. And a lot of Trump supporters, in fact, there was just an article in the New York Times about this yesterday, an op-ed about this yesterday, which I thought was so interesting, pointed out that many Trump supporters just started to follow him around from gathering to gathering, just to have a social community, because they really didn't have one before. And the things that people will do and say in the service of, I would say brotherhood, like in the service of feeling connected to others, is remarkable. And we know this again and again and again. And it can have wonderful effects, and it can have tragic effects. I'm thinking of cults and things like that. So,
and there's always that evolutionary base. I think, if I recall correctly, there's also these scans that show when you put people up on these functional MRIs and you allow them to have certain discourse, and you notice that there is a disagreement, there's a cognitive dissonance that tends to occur. And once that happens, you're more than likely to fall back to your whatever you know best.
Right, because that's what's metabolically most efficient. It basically, you have to think of it like exercise. When you go to exercise, you make a major metabolic outlay. In fact, unless you're, a professional, most people feel really unpleasant while they're exercising. They might feel great afterwards, but while they're exercising, not pleasant, because they're near their ventilatory load. They're burning glucose at a rate that isn't being replaced, and they're basically using up their resources, which hopefully they'll replenish later. But it is a great investment in a healthy brain and a healthy body. It's just in the moment, it feels like shit.
Yeah.
Okay. And to some extent, talking to people who are really different from you, exposing yourself to people that you have no familiarity with, is exactly the same kind of deal where, there's the two most expensive things your brain can do is learn something new, deal with ambiguity and learn something new, move your body.
Yeah.
So putting yourself in a situation where you are likely to encounter people who are unlike you, who believe things who look different from you, who have different values than you, who, believe different things than you, that's actually a metabolically costly thing to do. And if you're already encumbered, if you're already fatigued, you're not going to exercise. And if you're already fatigued, you're not going to put yourself in a position where you're going to have a meaningful dialogue with someone who's, has values that are really, really different from yours.
Well, Lisa, I know your time is very valuable and you are very busy. We scheduled this for an hour, so I don't want to waste any more time. But to end this off, I just have one last question. What do you think about my biology and in general people's biology that sends us on this quest? Because I labeled this podcast Mind-Body Solution. It is a quest to conquer the mind-body problem. What is this innate desire that I have to try and answer such a deep question? Why do you think we're all in search for such deep answers?
I don't think we're all in search for deep answers. I think you are and I am, and maybe all the people listening to your podcast and the people who, read my books, but I don't think everybody is.
I think we are, just to end it off.
Just why are we?
Yeah.
Well, there probably isn't one reason, there's no essence of, I know for me, I can't speak for you. I'm curious. I'm really curious because we have the kind of brain in conversation with the body and the world around that can make many, many, many different kinds of minds. And how does that work? Like, how does that happen? And why is there such diversity? And what's the value of that diversity? And so these are the kinds of questions. This is why I'm asking this question. And fundamentally, I want to know, when I experience something mental, what is the physical basis of that? And that involves, understanding the interaction between, means understanding the evolution and the development and the moment-to-moment biology of the brain, but not only the brain, right? Also the body and the world, and that world happens to be populated with other brains and bodies. And so for me, it's really a question of curiosity, like how is this working? What is it for you?
I think it's very similar. I always had this very curious mindset. I mean, I initially wanted to be an astrophysicist, possibly do physical cosmology, to try and understand this ontological reality. Why are we here? How did we get here? And not in a metaphysical sense. I'm hoping that
right.
it's something
very real. Exactly.
Yeah, that we can figure out that we can explain this epistemology into some sort of an ontology that is real. But let's hope it's possible.
I think it is possible. I just think we have to free ourselves from some of our assumptions. And I think that the answer is going to be an inherently relational answer. And so if you haven't already read Carlos Rovelli's book, Helgoland, where he's explaining his relational theory of quantum mechanics, you really should, because it's
I've read some of his other works, but
this book though is a gem. It's a gem, and I found it really, really useful actually. As it picks up on themes that I myself use in my own work, and I'm obviously studying something very different. So I think you might like it. Maybe some of your listeners might like it too.
No, definitely. I'm definitely going to check that out. Lisa, thank you so much for your time. I really look forward to more of your work. Your book's very fascinating. Your research, you are, as I said, among the top 1% scientists cited in your field. So it's exceptional work that you do. So thank you so much for all your contributions to the field.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Pleasure being here. Thank you for asking me. This was a delightful conversation.
Thanks. It was very enlightening. And because of you, I think all the listeners have taken at least one step closer to the mind-body solution.
Well, that would be wonderful.